Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week shot to fame last year with the hit Endless Winter. He emigrated to the United States from the Crimea and has worked as an ER nurse. In the game world, he's both a designer and a publisher with such titles as Rurik, Dawn of Kiev and Dice Hospital. As a publisher through his imprint Half a Kingdom Games, he's published Resurgence. My guest this week is Stan Kordonskiy. Stan, welcome to the cabin.
Thank you so much. So great to be here.
So my first question is how difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games to take to the cabin?
Quite difficult. I fear that in the end I was a bit arbitrary with some of those choices because I tend to not have like absolute favorites. I tend to have like a really hard time picking anything favorite, like favorite food, favorite beer, favorite, song. So it's always a bit tricky. So I have to think about it in a roundabout way and to help myself kind of narrow it down.
And did you have any criteria? Was it sort of utility? Was it nostalgia? Anything like that?
Yeah, I was thinking like, okay, so I'm kind of stuck there. So some of these should be maybe solo-able games so that in case, I'm there by myself or people don't feel like playing them, but then also some that will be fun to play with other people. And some they would fit a variety of people because I don't know who's going to wander in. And so I thought, I should get something that hits kind of different notes in different player types. And also, obviously, I have to enjoy all of them. And also teaching. I assume I'm teaching these games. I never assume people know the games. So I kind of picked them on how easy they are to explain, how fast do I expect people to kind of be able to play them.
And the games you've chosen are quite varied. Are you an omni gamer or do you have a happy place when it comes to gaming?
I am an omni gamer. At least I'd like to think of myself that way. I think that I do have preference. I think my preference lies in kind of midway Euro style. But I have enjoyed party games. I have enjoyed dudes on the map war games. I have enjoyed very light family games and, everything in between. I love innovation. I love simple card games, just trick-taking games, things like that. Backgammon. I'm pretty, I have pretty wide kind of interest because I feel like they scratch different parts of my brain and sort of different pleasure buttons get pushed with different games.
And do you think being a designer means you kind of have to be an omni gamer because you have to know what's out there in the market?
I think it helps. I don't think you have to, but I think to understand what makes games popular, what makes games good, I think it's helpful if you play them, and sometimes maybe you'll to give you some ideas. Like genre crossovers and things like that. It's pretty hard to do if you plant yourself squarely in one genre. Like, let's say, I'm only going to play kind of 2-player abstract strategy games because I love it. And I'm going to design those games. Well, sure, but then you limit yourself to the knowledge of only that genre and where your idea is going to come from. How are you going to innovate on the existing gameplay? You only working with this very limited pool. So I do think it helps. But do you have to play every game ever made or understand every style ever made? I don't think you do. I think I probably have some blind spots that I'm not even aware of, some games or genres that I'll probably miss entirely. Actually, I do know, like RPG is kind of a big one with me. I never really played a proper pen and paper RPG. So unless you count something like a video game RPG, which is a little bit of a different animal, I have very small kind of understanding and connection to that genre. But yeah, it helps to be well rounded.
And are you lucky enough to have a game group near you that enables you to play all of these different sorts of things?
Yeah, most definitely. I do have that. I also, my wife and I play quite a bit. The two player, um, and my daughter is getting a little bit older. She's going on 7, and she's getting kind of better at playing a variety of different games. And then on top of that, yeah, I have like a play testing group where we tend to play test mostly designs, but then also a separate group where we meet up and we just play board games for fun. But I will be honest, with the demand on my time that the board game design and publishing has placed, um, I play fewer and fewer outside games. It's mostly play testing, mostly designing, but I do try to squeeze in at least once weekly, play something that's not by me or something new to me. So yeah, it's tough, but I do have plenty of people around that I can call on to play games.
And to what extent does being a designer ruin the gameplay experience for you? Are you always on? Are you always analysing what you play?
I definitely analyze what I play, but I don't think that it's a negative in my case. I enjoy that part. I think it absorbs me even further as I play the board game. Sometimes I will start mentally kind of peeling back the layers and try to kind of glimpse under the hood of the design, so to speak. And I try to be like, oh, I wonder why this is 3 points and this is four. And then I'll think like, oh, it's because there's opportunity cost that's lower for this. And it gives me like this weird, satisfaction that, one might get from solving a Sudoku puzzle or something. You punch just the right number and it all comes together. And sometimes people don't even know around the table I'm doing it. And sometimes I will loudly announce it. It depends. So, um, but no, yeah, it's just a different fun. It's like fun on top of fun, like understanding the games, understanding the design intent of it, seeing kind of brilliance perhaps, or some new thing that maybe not so obvious. It's a big source of continuing kind of enjoyment for me in playing and designing board games.
So let's go back to the beginning then. So you were born in the Soviet Union. What are your memories of those times?
Well, I definitely have some, and one thing I remember is having picture of Lenin everywhere. Like my kindergarten had a picture of Lenin hanging there. My father's office had a picture of Lenin hanging there. All these public spaces, we had a big statue of Lenin in the middle of our little town, and they would bus us on Lenin's birthday. They would bus us to this giant statue, and then all the kids would buy flowers. Parents will buy flowers, and you'll bring flowers to school. They'll load you up on the bus, and they bus you to this giant stone statue, and you go up on the steps and you lay these flowers. And I remember thinking that that's where he was buried because I was a kid and I thought, well, they somebody dies, they put like a grave marker. So I thought my little city in Crimea, Simferopol, was like the burial place of Lenin. So I just have this memory of that. It even seemed weird to me as a child that was we would do. That there just seems something odd about them kind of busing us over there and having us go up and put the flowers down, then get back on the bus and go back. I didn't understand the point, and this pointlessness of this kind of communist pageantry is kind of stuck with me. How many things they did that were sort of a waste of time and money really were just no different from just any kind of abstract, ritual you might perform, but was infused with some meaning. supposedly that wasn't there. And all the propaganda and lies comes with that. So not to say that was very like a deeply unhappy childhood. Obviously I was oblivious to a lot of things that were going around me. My parents weren't, and they try to shelter us from, kind of more unpleasant things and have us a happy childhood. And I did have one, I believe. But, as I got older and I kind of entered the age of critical thinking, the Soviet Union fell apart. So at that time, I no longer kind of have an opinion of it because it was gone and the history, I guess, moved on, we'll say. So, all my communist memories, you figure I'm 79 and it fell apart in 91. So I was, barely, 11 or 12 years old at the time. So kind of too young to really have a strong opinion or very deep memories of it.
I mean, I live in Berlin and I've spoken to people who were kids, sort of similar to our age, who were kids during the East German times. And, they kind of understood, this is a place where the Stasi live. Don't go and play over there. If you're at school, don't tell your teachers you're watching Western TV at night. I mean, when you were there, even if you were a sort of 9 or 10-year-old kid, was there any sort of conception of the nature of the regime and that, saying the wrong thing could get your parents in trouble?
Yeah, there was a bit of that. I distinctly remember traveling by train one time with my grandmother and grandfather, and I was probably, 7 or 8. I don't know exactly how old I was, but fairly young. Obviously, my grandma and grandfather, they lived their whole life under communist regime pretty much. And they were a lot more uptight about a lot of things than my parents were, because my parents, I think, realized the times kind of moved on. The regime sort of loosened its grip a little bit as far as like the secret police and repressions went. But my grandparents still had it very deeply ingrained, this kind of fear, because I remember traveling with them and I was telling jokes as young children do, some silly jokes, they kind of laugh. And then I say a joke and I sort of like have a political slant. And I remember my grandfather just face kind of became really stony. And he just kind of looked at me and he said, you know what, you tell whatever jokes you like, but please don't tell political jokes. And so, I kind of dismissed it at the time, but then I realized after, he just, it's this in his time, that was perhaps something you could disappear forever for, just telling a joke that involves the leader of the country. But, growing up, like I said, in the 80s, it was a bit looser. You wouldn't really get arrested for telling a joke. And, but definitely there was this feeling that you never really know. You got a feeling that the regime at the time is mostly concerned with itself, not really concerned with its citizens. So you sort of fend for yourself and you sort of watch your own back, because there's not going to be a written warning. There's not going to be, a talking to. There's just going to be consequences. And, it was more pronounced in the older generation, but it existed, I think, in all citizens, sort of this unease that, what rights do I really have? Who guarantees my rights? The police is owned by the government. The security services are owned by the government. The ruling party, kind of this monolithic, regime. So who do I turn to? Who represents me? And the answer was no one really represented you. You kind of just represented yourself as best you could.
And to what degree do you think your upbringing in an environment like that has molded the person you are today?
I don't know. It's hard to say. It would have to be an outside observer, I think. I think it must have had some impact on me. I don't know exactly what it is. And I tend to sort of, I guess, take what I hear with a grain of salt as far as things that are being, reported or, things that either the government or the news channels kind of give us truth. We are aware that those things aren't always true. And to a lot of people, it was kind of an eye-opening as more and more sort of things are exposed as like, hey, this isn't true, this isn't, this politician is lying, or this, channel reported an untrue fact, it never shocked me because I grew up in the atmosphere where you couldn't trust anything that TV reported. You couldn't trust anything that the great leaders said. Not to say that I'm completely mistrusting. I don't believe anything anybody says. But my first instinct is when I receive a piece of information or some news report that's really important from, media or via some government, reporting, my first thing is to think about it for a bit before I start getting too excited, because I think, well, what are the odds that this is, somehow twisted or somehow untrue? So that would be like one way that I know that I'm kind of not, it may have impacted me in that way. But I'm sure there are other ways as well. But not, maybe I'm just not aware of it.
So when did you emigrate to the States, and sort of why and how did you manage to do it?
Well, the 1997 we came over. We started the process, and by we I mean my father, because I was still kind of a young teenager at that point, just kind of living my carefree life, finishing high school. And so my father takes a trip to New York to visit a friend on a tourist visa. A friend of his who immigrated some years earlier. He sees how the friend lives. He kind of sees for the first time the true kind of nature of the United States, not as it's reported, in Ukraine at the time, because this is Ukraine at the time. We live in Crimea, in Ukraine. So there is more truth going around, but there's still kind of difference between hearing a report and seeing it with your own eyes. But long story short, he thinks that it's just much better place to live, much better opportunities. He comes back and he kind of gets this mission that he must find, file all the right paperwork and find a way to immigrate. So he sets off to do that. On top of that, he starts feeling kind of more and more unsafe. We're talking about the 90s, very lawless time in Ukraine and pretty much everywhere in the former Soviet Union. But lots of gang activities, lots of organized crime, a lot of lawlessness, kind of a loss of sort of a law enforcement, kind of a loss of policing. We have like huge inflation where, everything, in the morning things are costing 1,000, in the evening it costs 10,000, the money is losing no value. So he starts feeling really like, well, where's this all headed? Now we know where we kind of ended up with this unfortunate war. But at the time, he's thinking this might end up in some sort of armed conflict or civil war or something. And so all of that makes him decide, I'm going to just leave everything behind and just start over with nothing. United States. And over the next, 2 or 3 years, it's a long process at the time, he manages to secure the right paperwork and get us immigrated to the United States, properly. And then, we become permanent residents and then eventually citizens. So we kind of went the long way. We kind of went through the process. I think from start to finish, we're talking about 7 or 8 years from the time he decides to immigrate to the time we actually receive our citizenship in the U.S.
And how was that for you? Was there culture shock? I mean, how was your English at the time and things like that?
English was kind of bad, but the culture shock, definitely. Everything was, new and exciting. So not a negative culture shock, kind of like, I'm a young man at the time. I'm like 17, barely 18 years old. I feel like that's a natural time when, young people kind of go off to explore and they want to experience new things and go on adventures. And so I think it was a lot easier for me than, for example, my parents who have had to leave everything behind. I'm not leaving behind that much at that time. I just go from being a high school student, to just going, graduating and just going to a new land. So it was kind of pleasant. It was some, some stress in learning English and things like that. But for some reason, I didn't have much of a doubt that I would be able to speak English just fine. So it just didn't stress me out. And, I just kind of dove into it and, try to just assimilate in the culture and get a job and do all the things that I saw people around me doing and speak as much English as I could. And, it worked out. I think in a year or two, then I became pretty conversational in English and, enrolled in the college. And, now it's been so long that I mostly think and speak in English for the most part.
So when did hobby games enter your life then, and what were the games that really grabbed you?
Well, if we really start really early, my exposure to games were some basic games in Russia. We had some mass market games like Risk, Monopoly, things like that. We had access to, some children's games. Also, like playing chess, checkers, playing backgammon, playing, trick-taking card games or other types of card games. Very common entertainment for people. So it wasn't unusual to go to someone's house and, your father is playing their father in the chess match as they're kind of hanging out. So, the idea that you play games for fun and entertainment, and to sharpen your mind and kind of like, quote unquote, you beating someone in the card game was pretty natural. And so I had this kind of exposure to that part of it. And then upon, entering the United States, and I ended up in a local board game store called Napoleon's. It no longer exists, but it was a board game store in Shorewood in Milwaukee. And it just had, a huge impact on me because I realized there was this like beyond Risk, Monopoly, and checkers. There was this like enormous world of games that I had no idea existed. And that was kind of my, entry point into the hobby from, kind of a more involved, more time consuming. It became a hobby, not just something you get out and play occasionally because people come over. It's something that you like schedule and plan and seek an opportunity to play, which is a little bit different from how we interacted with games, where it was more like on a opportunistic thing. It's like, hey, we got some time to kill. Maybe we're traveling. Let's play a card game. So that was my initial kind of exposure to it, I think, in the States.
So your first game then is a very popular one, and this is Terraforming Mars. Why do you think this game has been so successful?
I mean, I just think it's a really good game. People really underestimate the power of a good design. Always these little factors are looked at, I think, and especially in this crowdfunding age where marketing and packaging becomes almost more important because you're trying to get eyeballs on the product. You're trying to get this kind of big whirlwind of anticipation that it's just sort of gets overlooked. Some games are just well designed, and Terraforming Mars is a well designed game. It has multiple ways to play, multiple routes to victory, but it has a very clean game progression system where you have these temperature track and oxygen track and these oceans, and as they populate the board, you can kind of physically see and feel that the game is progressing towards the end. It has a nice ramp up effect where, because they tie your scoring to your income, the more you score, the higher your income gets, which means you just naturally become better and stronger, and you feel more powerful in the game. You don't have to choose, well, do I want to score or do I want to increase my income? Although there is that in the game too, right? So there's sometimes some cards will increase your income but not your score. So that exists too. So there's all these layers there, but at the most basic, the game has a very good curve. It starts and then it kind of ramps up and then it ends. It ends in a satisfying conclusion because the world is always terraformed, win or lose. You end up with this planet that was blank and now it has cities and oceans and forests and special features. And it's a very satisfying feeling. It's almost hard to be a sore loser, looking on this thing you helped create. And I think that game does it almost better than any other games. There are many, many games where you build a city, you terraform a world, you do all these things. The way that Terraforming Mars does it is both not overly complex, and somehow feels true to this fictional process, to the point where your brain can just relax. Like you don't have to keep suspending your disbelief. You can just play the game, engage in its systems, and then you end up with this kind of a beautiful result.
And this is a game that's had a lot of expansions and even sort of alternative versions. Do these improve the Terraforming Mars experience, or does it get to a point where expansions start to detract from games?
I think that's a question that kind of every player has to answer for themselves. I think players probably have like favorite, least favorite expansions. I enjoy them. I think I have pretty much every one. I think this is just my opinion. It's not objective, but I think having different maps is great. Like it increased my enjoyment of the game, because if there is one thing that gets kind of static is the map, and you kind of know the best spots to place things. And so the different maps really help with that. I also enjoyed just having extra cards, having colonies, but I can also see someone saying, well, it's such a tight game already. Why throw more wrenches? Like you're diluting the deck. There's more of a chance that something won't show up, because that's always the thing that worries people with Terraforming Mars, that some technology that they really want, isn't showing up because the deck gets bloated. It's all just a matter of taste. I think that extra content, personally, I'm glad it's there, and I can choose to play it or to play with it or not to play with it. But it's a personal thing for all different players as to what they think of that.
And I've not played it extensively, but I played it a couple of times. And one thing that struck me was you have this Euro game that then has this really aggressive take that just sort of slapped onto it. Do you think the take that in the game works, or do you think it feels out of place?
Again, this is my personal opinion. I think it feels out of place. I do feel that there was something was added for quote unquote interaction. I don't know, obviously, their intention, but I feel strongly that way. I also feel the same about Arc Nova, where they added these cards that have these take that effect. But I think they sort of learned from Terraforming Mars, and what they did there is they made then an alternate power. And when I play Arc Nova, I never play with take that. We always use alternate power. And that tells me when you put something like that, when you put the safety switch in the game, that this is problematic. Otherwise, why would you do that? So you chose the take that powers only to put the safety switch on, because you knew it was going to be not well received by a lot of people. And so I feel very strongly the same way about Terraforming Mars, that it's unnecessary. And I think their safety switch is that it's actually not that worthwhile, those take that cards. Because when you look at sort of their costs and opportunity costs that are connected to those specific cards that, destroy your plants or, steal something from you, they are kind of less, they're less efficient than simply playing something that helps you. And so again, that just kind of tells me perhaps the designers, the developers were aware that they're not great. But I feel like there's this pressure with Euro games to show that they are interactive, to show that there's some sort of player interaction. And, direct player interaction via take that is one of the easiest things to kind of point to and say, see, my game has player interaction. I played a card and it affects you directly. But I think it's out of place. But I also want to say that I feel it's fairly minor. It doesn't affect my enjoyment of the game that much. I think it doesn't have a big impact on the game. But if it was completely removed, I wouldn't miss it at all. And matter of fact, I want to say that Ares Expedition, the card game, they did remove them completely, which again goes to show that they were probably aware that that was the weakest part of the design.
So I want to talk now about your career in the medical profession. So what made you decide to become a nurse?
Well, it was a bit of a journey. Initially, I wanted to become a firefighter initially. I kind of gravitated towards that profession, and I ended up getting a degree in fire science. And then I was a volunteer firefighter on one of the local fire departments here in Wisconsin. And I was kind of going down that route. And it's a lengthy route. Like getting a fire service job isn't very easy. In the area and in the time that I was looking for one, it wasn't very easy, I should say. I have no idea what it's like now. I haven't looked at it in 20 years. But while I was going through that to make income, I started working on a private ambulance company because a part of your fire education was getting the emergency medical technician license. So I already had the license. So it was just a matter of applying and getting a job. And as I'm kind of started working on the ambulance, I got to go into these different hospitals and delivering people mostly to the emergency room. And I thought, well, this emergency room, seems pretty cool. I kind of like what they do here. I think it's kind of a cool job. So I started thinking, well, maybe this is something for me. And the fire department job wasn't happening. I've taken a couple tests. I didn't get picked. And so then I was like, well, what else am I going to do? I'm kind of getting older. I'm in my kind of early 20s at that time. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just go and get a nursing degree because I'm already kind of halfway there with all the credits I got from my fire degree. So that's what I did. I ended up entering in a nursing program and graduating from it. And was a quite good, need for nurses at that time, just as it is now. And then I kind of never looked back. I got my first nursing job in the emergency room, and that was in 2007. So fast forward to 2023, I've been working in emergency rooms ever since.
And how difficult is the nursing degree? I always imagine that sort of medical stuff, because, I studied the arts, which is, talking about your feelings, essentially. I mean, how difficult is it? I always imagine these things are very complex.
Well, now, you're downplaying the arts a little bit, I feel like. But I think the biggest difference from something like an art degree or something of that nature is that the nursing is all about, protocols, knowledge, evidence base, learning and doing things the right way. If we change anything in the profession, it's, evidence based, research based, policy that's stamped by multiple stamps, committee reviewed. Whereas, the arts is about self-expression and, finding a way to create something new in the world. There's really not a lot of things as a staff nurse to create something new. The best you can do is usually just to be really efficient and proficient with your skills. And so that's kind of what that education was like. It was a lot of, learning things by heart, memorizing things, getting good at physical skills, like how do you move the patient? How do you start an intravenous, infusion? How do you draw blood? How do you, clean and bandage a wound? How do you assess someone for all different types of situations? So a lot of it is just like a check-off sheet. And you don't really have much of a leeway to, kind of just make things up or change things on the fly. So I think that's, why I gravitated towards board games as my secondary thing, because it allows for self-expression and finding new ways of doing things as opposed to just being really good at doing stuff that's been pre-approved.
And outside of the States, the reputation of the American health service is not very good. And many perceive it as completely broken. What's your view on that?
I mean, it's a struggle, definitely. But, I've been, I've traveled around. And obviously I grew up in, born in the Soviet Union, grew up, during that in the 90s. And I'll tell you, I'll trade, the healthcare that we had in the Soviet Union and then later after the fall of the Soviet Union was just horrible. So compared to that, the United States healthcare system is fantastic. What I'm trying to say is that there's so many places in the world with a completely broken or non-existent healthcare system where people are just kind of left to fend for themselves, with leaky hospital rooms, no medicine or equipment. We have a different issue here. What we have a for-profit, healthcare, which creates this issue of haves and have-nots, where your access kind of varies based on what you're able to afford. That is definitely something that rubs me and a lot of people the wrong way. But is it, the worst in the world? No, definitely not. It's something that I dearly hope is addressed here as time goes on. I think it's high time they sort of evaluated how important it is to have this private insurance dominated industry, private hospital dominated industry, and move to some alternate system where, sure, you can keep these private things. I'm not saying they need to be abolished, but then people also have an option of having some sort of universal healthcare like they do in Great Britain and other countries. But the scale is different. Obviously, we're talking about, kind of a huge country, and there's just a lot of issues. But to say that, yes, it is definitely a lot of problems. Definitely a lot of problems, a lot of things that high time were addressed in healthcare. But I think there's plenty of countries in the world where people would be very happy to trade their kind of healthcare for this one, if you know what I mean. Because, there is, the push come to shove, we do have a lot of resources, and we do have a lot of really great things that we're able to do medically.
And so you mentioned it, but you're an ER nurse, and I'm squeamish, and I frankly couldn't imagine anything more stressful than doing that job. And I imagine you see some things that that most people just couldn't handle. How do you not go crazy, I guess, is essentially my question.
I think it just comes down to something internal, a personality, what have you. I don't think I had a lot of trouble to begin with any of the more, I guess, gross things or, kind of like frightening things. I didn't have to, quote unquote, get over it. I just never really had much of a problem with it. Whereas I know some people, they sort of harden over time. They might start off being kind of squeamish, and then they sort of desensitize themselves to it. Whereas other people, they just never able to get over it, and they end up, most of the time you find out in training, because our training included a healthy amount of hands-on experience, quite a lot of clinicals, interacting with, sick people, doing things that you would be expected to do in your job. So then, if you're going to faint at the sight of blood, that's just something your body does, right? There is like a vasovagal reaction in some people. They can't control it. You're not going to be able to do this job because they can't be picking you up off the floor every time you draw someone's blood. So, it's just a natural thing that, like any job, some people aren't suited for some jobs, and nursing is no different. Medical jobs are no different. I personally, I'm not like fascinated by things either, so I don't necessarily seek out any kind of like special, spectacles or anything like that. My personal feeling is I just kind of take it as it comes. I concentrate on my job. I concentrate on a task that I need to do in a situation, and I don't really think too much about, I don't necessarily, think about other stuff. Like, I don't get distracted too much. I just think, okay, this person needs help. They have such and such problem. I know what to do, and I'm just going to do it. And, and then you kind of move on. So I guess that's my way of, not letting it bother me too much.
And so, you were a nurse during a worldwide pandemic. How was it working through the COVID crisis, and what did you learn from that?
I think that was the first time I actually felt kind of scared to go to work. It kind of got to me the newness of the virus, and the fact that they were projecting, these hundreds of millions of people were going to die. They likened it to Spanish flu, which, as we know, caused, enormous deaths around the world. And here I am kind of in the thick of it in the emergency room. And, going to work, I was kind of scared to get it, but I was even more scared for my parents to get it because, they're getting older. They don't, especially my father, doesn't have the best of health. Then I have a small daughter at the time. Our daughter is a toddler. So my wife is working in the ER. I work in the ER. So I'm thinking it's only a matter of time before we give it to our child, and who knows what happens. So felt very scared to go to work, very scared to bring it back and give it to people. Kind of, taking your clothes off in the garage, and so you're not, walking in the house in the clothes you're working in, and all the safety equipment. But in the back of your mind, you're always like, am I going to be the reason that someone will die? I felt like I was healthy enough and young enough to where I could get really sick, but I didn't think there was like a strong chance of me dying. But I did think there was a pretty good chance that I would get too sick to work, sick for a long time, which, as we touched upon, is kind of a financial ruin in the States. So that was the biggest thing for me. I was still doing kind of the same things that I normally do, and ironically, we didn't see more patients during the pandemic. Matter of fact, most places the census went down. There were fewer patients because people were too frightened to go to the hospital, too frightened to go for a minor problem and get COVID and die. So we sort of had a less of a flow, ironically, but the mental stress of it was quite heavy. So now that we know more about the virus, and now that I had it, and pretty much everybody I know had it, we aren't as concerned about it. But at the time, it was quite frightening.
And so, there's a big nursing strike going on in the UK at the moment. And, at times nursing seems like a thankless job. Why should a person go into nursing?
Well, I mean, it's a satisfaction of a job well done, I guess you would say. I think that it's any job you can make an impact, right? There's no job where you don't impact society and other people in some way. But I think in nursing, it's the most obvious, or not most, but one of the more obvious, right? Especially in emergency nursing, because you have so many opportunities just to fix something on the spot. Somebody comes, they have a cut, the cut is clean, the cut is sutured, the person, has no more pain, they're fine. And I think that's the satisfaction that keeps people doing this job, keeps people wanting to be nurses. At the most base level, that's just really great to go to work and then, know that you made all these actual measurable impacts, that are immediate feedback. Oh, thank you so much. I feel so much better. Now, of course, you don't always have the wins. Sometimes you don't, but it really balances out. There's really that opportunity. And I think that's what drives a lot of medical people, in the end of the day. You got to do something, you got to do a job. And, I gravitated to these jobs like firefighting, ambulance, they all have this similarity where there is a problem, we're fixing the problem is fixed, everybody says hooray, in the perfect world, obviously. In real world, doesn't always work out like that. But on best days, it is like that. So I think that's why people do it. I don't know anyone who's immune to that good feeling that you get from something like that.
So your next game then is a relatively new one, this Cat in the Box. How does this game sort of reinvent trick-taking?
Well, I've never played a game like that. I played so many trick-taking games, and I kind of gave up on playing a commercial trick-taking game because I feel like all the existing trick-taking games are as good or better. And then this game drops in my lap, and I play it, and it just blows my mind that someone takes something so old and well-traveled as trick-taking, and, this game where you have to, call your own suits, and you can tell people you don't have a suit, but there's like all these consequences to, it's just great. If I would say anyone who loves trick-taking games and hasn't tried it, you probably should give it a try. It's not an expensive game. It's a very attractive package. Um, and I've shown it to folks that only play trick taking games, don't really play board games, like play card games. And usually they universally like it as well. And it's just a great alternative to a standard trick taking.
And so why are you, is that part of the reason you're taking this to the cabin? Because it seems to universally work?
Yes. Also, it's one of the only games that I've played where you can play a 5-player game of trick taking, and it works beautifully. It works almost with any number of players just as well. It scales beautifully. So I figured for our cabin, you can't play it solo, but I figured any number of people are able to play this. And on top of that, it's not super hard to teach. And on top of this, it's a trick-taking game, so it's a low barrier of entry. You say, like, hey, have you ever played hearts or spades? Let me show you this. You don't have to be a board game enthusiast to sort of get into it and play.
And has this game, because it does seem very fresh and very innovative, has it taught you anything about design?
I think it taught me that no matter how well traveled or how established a genre may seem, there is a way to refresh it. And I think that's a great reminder, because sometimes you're like, oh, what am I doing? Am I making another Dudes on the Map game? I'm making another drafting game. I'm making another action selection game. There's no more iteration in this. There's no more innovation in this. And yet you're dealing in a board game, midweight Euro, let's say, you're dealing with so many things, right? There's so many ways you can, do things and spin things. Here you have almost nothing. You have a game that's a trick-taking card game. And you would think there is no room for any innovation, for anything new. And yet there is. So yeah, it's great. It's like a breath of fresh air. It's a reminder, like, think harder, try harder to come up with new stuff.
So I want to talk now about you as a designer. So, you got into hobby games, but when did you decide that you wanted to make them as well as play them?
I think it was like around 2008, 2009. I think Game of Thrones was going strong. Maybe it was 2010. I don't remember, but Game of Thrones hit, HBO. Or no, wait, was I reading the books? I think I might have been reading the books. But anyway, I got enthralled with Game of Thrones. And I just got this idea that I really wanted a board game version of that book. And there was actually one existed already, but I wasn't aware of it. So I just started like sketching this idea. And that was the first game that I ever kind of like designed from start to finish. Now, it was my first effort, so it wasn't really any good, but it was so much fun to do it. And I even like play tested it, which I didn't even know the term play testing. I said, just let's play this game. I didn't, call it a prototype. I didn't call it a play testing. There was no framework there. It was just completely out of just desire to create it. I created. It was no different from like drawing a picture or, or writing a short story or something. It was just, it was very satisfying. And then that was it for a while. Then in a few years, I actually moved. At the time I lived in Jacksonville, Florida. I moved back to Milwaukee, and then I start dating. I get married to my wife, Rachel, and all of a sudden I'm like, I want to make another game. And that's how I started designing Dice Hospital. And again, like no real plan, but as I design it, I become aware that there's like Game Crafter and I can make a quite nice prototype. So it makes me want to like do more things. So I learn more things at this point. I kind of learn how to use a computer to do some of my assets. I learned how to use Game Crafter a little bit. So it just becomes a little bit bigger. And it kind of stops there until a publisher reaches out to me from the UK and says, hey, I saw this game on Game Crafter. I think I would like to publish it. Would you be willing to license it to me? And then I thought, well, I mean, I know that submissions existed, but I wasn't really seeking a submission. So at that point, I thought, oh, I can make these games And then these people are going to publish them, and I'll have a game with my name on the box. And that's pretty cool. And so I almost immediately go into like into lockup, like almost parallel with this. And then I get that also someone interested in that. And at that point, I start thinking, wow, I need some sort of a business plan here. Like, it's kind of like a business. I'm spending a lot of time on this. I'm spending some money on this. It takes time away from other things. So I need to treat it a little bit less like a hobby and a little bit more like a business. And that's sort of like the birth of my, Half a Kingdom games, and me starting to think of myself as a designer who doesn't design just for pleasure and friends, but designs for an outside audience.
And so what was that feeling like when, you held that game in your hand with your name on it for the first time? And does that feeling get better or worse the more games you get published?
There is nothing quite like those first couple games, I'll be honest with you. I'd love to tell you that it's just as great, but it's just not the way human brain works. Repeated stimulus, usually you have a lesser and lesser response. Now, it still is extremely satisfying to me, so I don't want people to take away from this that I lost all pleasure and life goes on after the joy of living is gone type of thing. But there's nothing quite like it. Like those first couple games, just seeing that name on the box, it's just, you don't really think of anything else at that point. You're just like, wow, here it is, right? Now I think I know a lot more about the industry. I worry about more things. I think at the time that I got like Lockup and Dice Hospital, I worried about nothing. I'm like, everything is great, sunny skies, my dream came true. Now I'm thinking of things like, is this game, gonna have longevity? Is this game gonna have expansions? Is this game gonna, all these things? Is my relationship with this publisher? Do I have a great relationship with them? Do I work with them more? Do I go a different route? There's just a lot of worries and decisions that I'm making now with my designs. Then at that time, everything was just like, you just move from goal to goal. First goal, design a game. Second goal, get someone to want to publish it. Third goal, hold the finished product in your hand and rejoice. Mission accomplished, hooray. It's a bit more complex now. So there is still a lot of celebration and a lot of pleasure, but nothing like those couple of first ones.
And so what would you say then? It seems to me, looking at your games, that you're quite varied in the genres and mechanisms that you deploy. What is your central game design ethos?
Well, I'll be honest. I was very concerned with being kind of pigeonholed in the beginning. I don't know why. There's plenty of great designers that build their portfolios and just doing a thing well. But for some reason, I was thinking, well, my first game was Dice Hospital, and there's all these dice manipulation, and people thought it was rather clever, using dice as patients and putting them in little ambulances and whatnot. But then I thought, well, my next game should be diceless, right? So then I make Lockup, which is a diceless game, kind of hidden or semi-hidden bidding worker assignment game. And then Rurik, I'm like, I'm going to make this new thing, auction programming, where you like kind of like bidding on actions now and you're pushing each other off. And I was just really concerned about seem like I had a lot of like weapons in my arsenal. I'm less concerned with it now. I'm just more concerned with making a really good experience for people. I'm less concerned of proving that I can work outside of my comfort zone. I think there's nothing wrong with having a comfort zone. I think for me, it's probably like light mid to midweight Euros is kind of where I thrive. And I'm not trying to, go ahead and design a party game because I don't have much interest in doing that. So I'm a little bit more, settled in that way. So my design ethos is first and foremost an experience that feels worthwhile, because I do feel like people engaging in board games, it takes a fair amount of effort compared to other entertainment routes. I can watch a movie on Netflix, or I can play an app game that is such low time investment for me. It's just, instant gratification and it's done. And then I'm asking you to learn these rules, to get your friends together, to sit down, to set it up, to explain it. It's in this day and age that's fairly involved. Maybe in the 90s, before the internet, before the apps, before all that stuff, that was probably just a normal thing, one did to get some sort of some sort of entertainment. But now I feel like you are asking people a lot, and you need to give them something back that they need to feel like, wow, that felt great. I'm glad we did this. So I kind of hunt that down, as I play test games and work on the designs. I'm trying to make sure that it's in there for the audience.
And I said at the beginning of the show, Endless Winter has been a big hit, and I've seen it come out, and I've seen the online reaction to it. It's a very impressive game. What do you think the success can be put down to for Endless Winter?
So many factors, man. There's so many factors. I don't know. I think it's impossible to know at this point because, okay, so factor one is obviously the game itself, right? You have the game itself. You have sort of like the mechanisms that sound appealing. Then you have the game's appearance. Looks great. It's got this theme, okay, like Paleo American, kind of fantastical reimagining of the Ice Age, but still a little bit grounded where you're not playing just outright fiction. Then you have, the company, and the company is new, but they're giving people so much, and they're so responsive. They go in the extra mile. They're delivering this product. They're just, they really got people to engage, and you have the artist that is well respected, well liked in the industry. You got a good development team, all those things. You take any one of those things out, what do you end up with? We'll never know. What if this game wasn't published by Fantasia? What if it was published by a much smaller or company that wasn't as well versed in social interactions and Kickstarter? Or what if it was published by a big mass company? Or what if it was a different development team? Or we just have to assume that all those things are important, that all those things played their part. And I don't think it's something you can replicate. I think you couldn't combine all those factors again and end up with the same result. So I guess it's just one of those things that I'm just happy that it happened. When I was working on the game, I thought the game was quite fun to play. I definitely got that feeling I was mentioning earlier, like that it's worth the time you spend on it. But I couldn't have predicted at that time that it was going to be quite as popular as it ended up being.
So your next game then is Dune Imperium, and this game is a grab bag of mechanisms. How well does it blend them?
I mean, I really enjoy it. Again, the part of the reason I enjoy it is because you can play it with different counts. I do think it works well with different counts. I know not everybody thinks that, but I enjoy it. And I think that it's easy enough to explain. I like deck building games, and I wanted to include a deck building game into my menagerie of games. And I was really thinking hard between something like Clank, Ascension, Mystic Vale, Endless Winter, this game. And I ended up settling on it because I feel like it's pretty compact and interconnected design-wise. I don't feel like it's a chore teaching it. I personally like Dune. I like Dune, the books. I like Dune, the movies. I like that, IP. So it does help me. People may or may not, like it or may not even be very aware of it. It just might seem like a weird science fiction world to them, but it was important to me that it has that. As far as different mechanisms, yeah, it uses several different mechanisms, but in the end of the day, I think they work well together. I think that this combat at the end of every round brings a much needed tension that a lot of these games lack from turn to turn. A lot of these deck building games, they just sort of have like big turns and small turns. Whereas this game, you're always kind of working towards this mini climax where you play a hand, and then the whole time your eye is on this battle. This battle is going to happen. There's no way that it won't happen. And as the game, again, has got a nice curve, same as Terraforming Mars, because you stage these rewards for combat and they get more and more important. And as you get late in the game, you just can't ignore them. And so it's just it funnels your strategy into this channel. And some people might not like that, but I like that because it's easier than to get people into it and to say, like, look, really, this is what you're working towards. You're working towards this goal. There isn't 7 ways for you to go about it. There's 1 or 2, but this is the one you can't really ignore. And that's what I like about the design is the cohesiveness of it, and that the focus on it is more narrow. That to me is an asset and not a bug.
And does the IP appeal to you? And do you think the game does Dune justice?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as much as any board game can, do. I think board game is a game first, or it should be a game first. And it does address. I think if you're really familiar with the books and everything else, I think you will see some parallels. Oh, this character does this because in the book this is their character. But of course, it's very abstracted. I would argue that all board games are abstracted. There's no simulation. It's always an abstraction to different degrees. And as far as that goes, I do feel like it represents the world of Dune fairly well. I do like Dune. I think it's a cool, universe, kind of, older sci-fi school, like a different way of writing sci-fi. So yeah, I think on that, I think that hits my notes on that front.
And how important? So I've played it and I enjoyed the game immensely, and I'm not a great Dune fan, and I thought I think it sort of hinted, and you talked about this, it being abstracted. It sort of hinted at Dune, but it felt to me that it could kind of be anything else. I mean, how important do you think the Dune thematic integration has been to the success of this game?
That's a great question. I think it's about how you frame the question, because I can retheme any game to be anything. A Terraforming Mars could be anything. It doesn't have to be terraforming a planet. It could be building anything anywhere. It could be building a children's playground. Ark Nova doesn't have to be about animals in the zoo. People just, I think, I think people tend to subdivide games into abstract and not abstract, so to speak, but I think they're all pretty abstract. I think it's more about what the game chooses to be, not about whether that theme is perfectly represented. Because, yes, they could have chosen they could have chosen Star Wars, they could have chosen, historical setting, let's say. But they've chosen Dune. And in choosing so, they've put the cards in the game that represent things that happen in Dune. They've represented harvesting of the spice. They've represented the worms. They've represented different faction. The faction, the faction that values water. The different characters. The character's kind of an evil schemer in the game does evil scheming things in the books. So yeah, that's what thematic integration to me is. And I think saying that a game could be something else is completely true about any game. And I don't think that's important, that it could have been something else. What's important is what it is. It does integrate theme into itself.
So I want to talk now, because you're Ukrainian, so I want to talk to you about the situation in the Ukraine. So the world's attention has been on Ukraine since last February. But to what degree do you think the West has been guilty of ignoring the invasion of Crimea in 2014? And I suppose you'll know especially about that coming from the Crimea yourself.
Yeah, it was, I'm not going to lay blame at anyone's feet. It's an extremely complex situation. Right now, it's just a great human tragedy that's going on. It's a horrible thing that kind of unthinkable, in this day and age that this would be happening. But it's definitely not the West's fault. What Putin did, he did because he wanted to do it, and he did it for his own selfish reasons. He's causing, deaths of, hundreds of thousands of people to stay in power, and that's my belief in what's going on. And he's a fresh reminder that a country that's supposedly a democracy could very easily slide into a totalitarian regime if a person controls too much of the power. And that is just all frightening and very sad to see in the 21st century. The invasion of Crimea, and at the same time the Crimea was annexed, there was this whole shadow war of Russia in eastern Ukraine, forming these militias and arming them and fermenting this war against Ukraine. And this was all going on. And I think the West hands were kind of tied at the time because of the scale of it. It was kind of hard to find a proportionate response to this, and it was kind of unclear where this was going to lead to. It seemed like kind of a local tragedy to them rather than like a worldwide emergency. But once this war was underway, even though, as we know, Putin doesn't call it war, it's a forbidden word to use. But once this war was underway, it became then a worldwide global emergency, and then they responded to that. So, it's a very, I think it's just a tragedy of this century is this thing, and it's unclear how much worse it will get, which is a very scary thing. And I just every day I hope to tune into the news and hear that there is some sort of ceasefire or some sort of withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. And I really am very anxious and eager for this war to end as soon as possible.
I mean, growing up in Crimea, did you feel Ukrainian? Did you feel Russian? Did you feel specifically Crimean? And the people around you, how did they feel?
Well, my personal ancestry is sort of a big mix. So my father's family, they are Jewish, Russian Jews, from, those little villages like you see in Fiddler on the Roof. That's where, they hail from, those little villages where the Jews were allowed to settle kind of away from the regional centers because, they had this kind of semi-segregated status. Then on my mother's side, we have Western Ukrainian, we have some Greek ancestry, we have some Russian ancestry as well. So we have, people who were speaking Yiddish, people who were speaking Russian, people who were speaking Ukrainian. Nobody spoke Greek, fortunately, but it all kind of comes together. You sort of feel like singling out any one ethnicity is doing disservice to the rest of it. Do I call myself Russian at expense of being identified as a Jewish person? If I identify as Jewish, does that mean I reject all my other ancestral parts? So I preferred not to do that growing up. Growing up, I was Russian speaking primarily. So I just thought of myself as that. While I speak Russian, most of my friends spoke Russian. Although almost all of us could speak Ukrainian. I could speak, read Ukrainian, write in Ukrainian, no problem. But the area where we lived, most everybody spoke Russian. People really didn't think about the labels at the time too much. People weren't trying to say like, well, you are Ukrainian and I'm Russian and here's this and you're that. And we were trying to work against that, I think, in our own small way, against, trying to label each other, like self-identify. Obviously, now it's no longer a case because now, you picking sides, essentially. You have to sort of say where you stand. And I stand with Ukraine 100%. And so I identify as Ukrainian, by which I mean I had a Ukrainian passport. I lived in Crimea, which is Ukraine, when I immigrated. And so it's more of a political statement to me than like a personal or like ethnic statement or anything like that. Because I also might be no surprise, think of myself as an American as well, because I've lived most of my life in the United States now, many years. I've absorbed a lot of cultural attitudes. I've absorbed a lot of cultural norms of the United States, so much so that I'm sure that if I went back to Ukraine, people would know from a mile away that I'm not from around there. It's just been a very long time. And so I think humans are more complex than, saying, I'm this or I'm that. But I think that when it comes to sort of a political statement and where you stand, I think it's important to say, hey, I am on this side. And then I think us, the former Ukrainian, immigrants from Ukraine, when we say that, I think that's what we mean. We mean we stand with Ukraine, we stand against Putin's war, we stand against his aggression, we stand against his occupation.
And how is it to be in the States reading the reports of the invasion of the Ukraine? Because I assume, it must have a very specific resonance for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, you have so much information, so much misinformation. I watch, reports from every corner. I watch Polish reports, Polish news. I watch French news. I watch BBC. I watch CNN. I watch Ukrainian news. I watch even Russian news because I want to know what the propaganda tells Russian people, right? I want to know what they're saying is happening. And when you see, for example, what BBC is saying and what Ukraine is reporting and what Russia is reporting, usually the truth is somewhere in the middle. Usually every side has a spin on it. Every side, it kind of goes back to our earlier point that I tend to kind of analyze the news rather than just absorb them. I'm very anxious that the truth is kind of hard to see. But there are some objective, truths, and that's that the death toll is climbing, that so many people lost their lives, so many people got injured, so much Ukrainian infrastructure has been lost, and Ukraine was already struggling economically because of the shadow war that Russia waged in large part. It was stymieing their economical growth because it's pretty hard to grow your economy and prosper and get foreign investments to come to your country where a part of your country is embroiled in some pseudo insurgency. And it's just very sad because even if the war, like I said, I want this war to be over right this instant, but even if it was, we're talking about long, hard, painful recovery, perhaps a generation or longer to just rebuild, just to get back to the starting point, just to start growing your lives and recovering from this. And I also think that it's tragic that the coexistence of all these, of Russian people, Ukrainian people, has been damaged. I'm not going to say irreparably, but it's going to, again, we might be looking at a generation or two before people will, let go and say like, okay, these Russians aren't the same Russians that invaded our country and, drone bombed our infrastructure and try to take over us. Like those scars don't heal very fast. And so seeing this on the news, the rhetoric of Russia, of the Ukrainians being the enemy, and the rhetoric of Ukrainians that the Russian is the enemy, this is a start of a very long and painful kind of process that we saw after World War II and other wars where, the peoples of the nations developed this hatred for each other just based on their ethnicity and geographic location. And that is a very, very tragic thing.
And were you surprised at the resolve that the Ukrainian people showed? I mean, I think Putin was under the impression he could just roll into Kiev and install a puppet government, and yet, we've seen incredible sort of heroism and resolve in the face of that. Was that a shock to you?
Yes. Yes, unfortunately, I have to admit, I would love to say that I had very high expectations and very high confidence But I must admit that if I'm completely truthful here, and I'm not trying to just paint myself as this flawless patriot of Ukraine, is that I had big doubts. Part of the reason was growing up in Ukraine, I knew that people were dodging the draft, that armed services had a very low prestige, that a lot of weaponry and infrastructure was being pilfered or neglected, and obviously this information is a 90s information, and we fast forward to 2022. That's a really long time. So I didn't know what the current status was, but part of me was thinking, well, it probably didn't get much better. Now, ironically, it did not ironically, but actually did get better. Ironically, it's the Russians who were playing at, oh, we rebuilt our army, we rebuilt our might, we have this like amazing professional army. They call themselves the Second Army, implying that only United States is greater than they are. Apparently, it's completely pilfered, completely, everything is stolen, everything is neglected, everything is disrepaired, the morale is terrible, the training is terrible. And so I think that's a good thing in this case, because that enabled Ukrainians to defend themselves, and in the end will enable them to overcome this occupation. But it is sad to see these people just being slaughtered, that have no real understanding or motivation to be in Ukraine. So that's the flip side of that, is just seeing this horrible toll, on human lives. But yeah, I was very impressed that in just a couple of decades, Ukraine was able to sort of make this very formidable armed force, and their continuing resolve in the face of this is nothing short of amazing and heroic.
So your next game then is one of yours, and this is Lock Up. Why is this one of your games that you just decided to take to the cabin?
So again, couple reasons that I talked about. You play 1 to 5, which is a great player count, and it plays very well with any player count. So that's a big plus. Not a hard game to explain. I do love the theme of it. I was very pleased that the publisher kept the theme. I was a little bit iffy because you're selling someone on the fact that, well, you're a prisoner in a fantasy prison. It might seem a bit edgy, or a bit like it might turn people off. Sometimes publishers tend to shy away from that. They don't really want to take a risk of turning off or generating social media, comments about how inappropriate this is. So that was cool. I thought it would be a cool theme. So it was great that they did. So I do love the theme. I do love the ease of explanation. It is a mid-level game. So I'm not saying it's super, super simple, but what you do is fairly straightforward. And then finally, I do like, again, similar to Dune Imperium, it has this very strong mini climax every round. So the round is this preparation for this end of the round resolution. And as the end of the round resolves, there's this domino effect in the game where your previous successes or failures affect your future options. And as you see these dominoes kind of fall, so to speak, that there's a big sense of accomplishment, and then you go right into the next round. And that is why I really like that game, and I picked it over some of the other ones I decided.
And so this is one of your early designs, and what were people's reactions to it, and how did it feel to sort of be reading people's views on your work?
It felt really good. It got really decent critical reception. I remember distinctly that Tom Vassell put it in his top 100 games of all time. I think it was number 68 or 69, something like that. And, this is the guy that, by his own words, played tens of thousands of games. So being in his top 100 was a big deal. And the fact that it was basically my first game, they, like I said, they were parallel with Dice Hospital. But it was just meant so much. I thought, wow, like there's tens of thousands of games this guy had played, and he picks my game. one of my first games to be an ed list, I felt really good about that. I thought there was a big boost to me. Like I knew at that point, okay, I can design a game. People will want to buy the game, but it's a bit different from being like critically received. Especially, there are a few people in the industry whose opinions I think, at least to me, matter because I feel like they have enough of a breadth of knowledge to actually have a good analysis of a game. And that is important to me. Like commercial success is important. What regular players think is important. But I also do not disregard that a reviewer thinks as well. I think that that is something that I pay attention to.
And why should we try Lockup if we haven't?
Well, like I said, all the above mentioned reasons. You have a very engaging system because it has this kind of semi-blind bidding worker and assignment type of phase where you're trying to divine, get inside people's heads, figure out what they do. You're trying to get resources and accomplish things while denying hopefully other people. But at the same time, the game has a healthy rubber band kind of catch-up mechanic where you cannot get shut out of it completely, so you can never just dominate it outright. And then you have this end of the round phase that feels great. You can kind of see your plans succeed and fail. And, the unique theme, I think the art in it is actually pretty great. I do like the package that the graphic designer and the artist and the publisher put together for it. There's just not a lot of games like it. I've heard it likened to Aladdin's Dragons, which I've never played, but I did sort of like looked it up after I heard people talk about it. So I think it's one of the lesser utilized kind of mechanisms in the game. And for folks who play games and have experience with a lot of mechanisms, sometimes that's a very good thing to try a game of this sort that uses a mechanism that aren't something they're used to interact with.
So let's talk about the future then. So what do you have coming out in the future?
Well, right now I'm very hard at work on Nova Roma, which is going to be, I'm going to put it on Kickstarter through Half a Kingdom Games again. Been working very, very hard on it. I got most art and graphic design assets done for it. So as soon as that's all done, I'm going to set a date for it. Probably, I'm thinking March, April of this year. So it's going to be big. It's going to consume a lot of my time. Parallel with that, we have I have a game with Elf Creek Games that should be heading to Kickstarter sometimes this year that I designed for them. And that's pretty exciting. There's not a whole lot of details yet on that. And then I believe I have another game probably for 2024. It's still kind of in the works with a company called Board and Dice. So we're still working things out, but that should be getting released 24. So, we're looking at a couple of games in 23, a couple of games in 24. There's a Kickstarter for a game I designed called Guild Academies of Valeria that's wrapping up right now. There's a couple days left, I think maybe 3 or 4 days. And that's from Daily Magic. So that's wrapping up now. So it should be getting, released or I should say delivered in 9 months or so. So it's definitely churning. There's definitely things happening. I just keep it going. I keep, working on designs for my own company as well as designs for other companies. And I just try to, kind of stay active and keep producing games that people like.
And so what niche do you think you fill within the board gaming world?
Well, that's a good question. It's hard for me to be super objective. Personally, I feel like my games are for people who have experience with games. Some people say it the beginner plus or something like that. So I feel like if you almost take any one of my games and you just plop it in front of the person that never played a board game, it's probably going to be a handful. because a lot of my games, they either iterate on things that people would know from other games, or they use these concepts. So being familiar with those concepts is helpful. Just based on that, I feel like folks that have played games, probably more of my audience, because they probably can see like the merit. They can kind of look to my mechanics pitch and think, "Wow, that sounds kind of interesting. That sounds a little bit different from what I know. That sounds like a cool thing." So I think that's kind of where I am. I'm not really for super heavy people. Like my games aren't, super thinky, like a Vital Lacerda game or something of that type. Neither are they these crowd pleasing, light games in the exploding kittens vein, that anybody can play, while they're drinking a pint. So yeah, it's I guess a game for a gamer, I guess you could say, is what I'm currently designing mostly.
And do you think you'd ever give up nursing to focus on game design full time?
I don't know that. I think that it's not very likely. Part of the reason is I just don't want to abandon a profession that I've spent last 15 years investing in. And that's a big one. I would want to maintain some sort of connection to it. Now, I might not be an emergency nurse forever. I might move into other, thankfully there's lots of different jobs that a person with a nursing degree can perform within healthcare system. But no, I don't think I would ever quit it outright. Even if I work pretty part-time already because of the demand that kind of board game world puts on me. But yeah, no, I would think it would be very unlikely that I would quit it outright. I think it's more likely that I would just maintain some sort of very part-time connection to it. If my kind of income stream switched completely to board gaming, design and publishing, I would still want to do some nursing just to keep up on all my certifications and skills and things like that.
So your last game then is another one of yours, and that's Rurik Dawn of Kiev. So a lot of people don't know the sort of story of the foundation of Kiev, the Vikings coming down and sort of forming a city and going off into Byzantium and all of that. I mean, it's an incredible story. How well does it fit into a game?
I mean, I think it's a great sort of a setup for a game like Rurik, because we are used to getting games like that with the Western European history. Western European medieval history, it's very popular, from game like a Carcassonne, to much heavier games. Game like Lancaster by Queen Games. There's just this long tradition, or like a Fief. It's just this long tradition of taking like English history, French history, Holy Roman Empire, and building like a big, impressive Euro game around it. And understandably so. There was a lot of intrigue going on. There was a lot of, cool power shifts and, larger than life individuals involved, and big battles with knights clashing with each other, betrayals. And, of course, this is something you want to, engage with. And, the history of Kievan Rus is no different. It's just filled with intrigue and, betrayals and all sorts of exciting things. It just hasn't really been touched that much. And a lot of those great things you mentioned, I wasn't even able to put in the game. I wanted to represent like the raids in Byzantium. I wanted to represent sort of like the intermarriage aspect that Kievan Rus had with foreign powers and things like that. But there's a limited amount of things you can put into a game like that and still have it to be fun. So I sort of concentrated more on, more abstracted things like controlling regions, taxing regions, growing your power, building things, engaging in like limited warfare, things like that. But I just wanted people to play it, and I'm sure that more than one person who played it had no idea if it was fact or fiction. I'm sure to some people it just seemed like a kind of a fully made up world, like Game of Thrones type of thing, where, all these characters are doing all these things. You've never heard any of their names. You don't know if they're historical persons or not. And I was hoping that those same people might just look it up and might become kind of fascinated by it. And that was a nice little benefit to it that I was after.
And did you feel uniquely qualified to tell this story in game form?
No, I definitely didn't feel uniquely qualified. Matter of fact, I felt a bit out of depth history-wise. I kept sort of reading information and doing research frantically as I was designing it. And it's rather hard because there's a lot of contradictory information about that age. You're dealing with some like a Soviet era historians who were trying to kind of spin things, politically. Then you have kind of like the Western historians that kind of like an outsider perspective on it. Then you have kind of like a modern history, which again could be politicized, not necessarily, but you have to be careful. Names of places, locations of places. People argue about so many things. Was this person real? Was this city in this geographic area? So I had to take a lot of liberties, and I definitely didn't feel like super qualified to do it. But I wasn't, again, making a historical lesson. I was making a game first and foremost. And it was just more meant to provoke thought. So I try to put just the most, so to speak, general things like names of people, names of places, just things that are like harder to dispute, because a lot of finer things are being disputed or being disagreed upon in scientific community. So yeah, that was it was quite a challenge, and I wish I was some sort of a history professor that specializes in that area of history, but sadly I'm not. So I had to just sort of sift through a lot of things and try to figure out which sources I could trust.
So I've got one more question for you. So you're heading out to the cabin, and you go around a corner, and the back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out down a ravine into a river and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Oh, wow. Now I have to limit my choices even further. Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm just gonna say Terraforming Mars. Final answer. I'm just gonna stick with it.
So, if people want to get hold of you, how can they go about doing that?
Well, you can always email me, halfakingdomgames.com. I'm on Facebook as well. You can use Messenger service to get a hold of me. I have a website, halfakingdomgames.com. You can go to that, and there's a way. There's my contact information is on there. So there's many ways to get a hold of me with the questions or anything like that. So yeah, totally. I'm always happy to answer people's questions and help out where I can.
Excellent. Well, Stan Kordonskiy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends. You can talk about it on social media. You can talk about it in your own blog, podcast, or video. Or you can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I manage to leg it from the Mrs. Mangles and the fact that everything is just a little harder than it should be, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.